And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, January 26th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton. Wherever you're listening from, I hope you weathered the storm, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, the drone economy is about to take off fast, with drones as a service the next big thing. Plus, a sweeping audit could reshape the 8A program, and federal contractors are bracing for what comes next. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. Government-wide, agencies saw a loss of about 320,000 federal employees over the course of 2025. As he marked 1 year in office, President Trump called those cuts to the federal workforce, quote, tremendous, unquote. But good government groups are painting a much darker picture of what's to come. Here with more is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, great to have you.
Nice to be with you, Terry.
What exactly did President Trump and the White House say about the overalls to the federal workforce this past year?
Well, of course, they were touting a lot of their changes to the federal workforce as what they said were wins over the last year. The White House released a list last week of 365 ways, essentially, that the government has changed over the last year and Trump's first year in office. That includes several changes that we, of course, know about from the federal workforce, things like the merit-based federal hiring plan, removing diversity, equity, and inclusion from different government programs and services, overhauling the probationary period and how that works for federal employees, requiring everyone to return to the office full time. And then, of course, top of mind for a lot of employees and those who are interested is just the simple cuts and decrease in size to the federal workforce. During a White House press conference last week, Trump touted those cuts, as you said, as tremendous.
But we've slashed tremendous numbers of people off the federal payroll. I mean, we have jobs where they had 10 people for every job. We're proud of the fact that we cut so many because, again, I don't want to cut people. But when you cut them and they go out and get a better job, I like to cut them. And sometimes they have to be forced to do that.
But good government groups are painting a different picture here. What have these stakeholders said about the changes to the workforce throughout 2025?
Well, Terry, you won't be really surprised to hear that a lot of these groups are very much in opposition to what President Trump and the White House have been saying about these cuts to the workforce. They say that the large-scale layoffs, cuts to government programs, were a really negative impact on how the government works and is able to serve the public. A lot of this information comes from the Partnership for Public Service, which is a nonpartisan organization that advocates for government reforms and improvements. Max Stier, who's the partnership's president and CEO, he described 2025 as, for the federal workforce and the government at large, a year unlike any other.
It was a challenging year for our government. Indeed, I would say the most significant reduction in federal government capacity over the course of a year that we've ever experienced in our history. And that reduction in capacity is best represented in our most important asset, our federal workforce.
The partnership also released a report last week with more details on the impacts of the federal workforce changes. What was in that report?
That's right. This report goes into a lot of detail about everything that we saw in terms of changes to the federal government, going in part agency specific and talking about cuts to agencies like the IRS, Social Security Administration, Department of Health and Human Services, and FEMA, and many other agencies, and just going into detail on how each of those agencies has been impacted by the staffing cuts, saying that, there's delays in basic services. There's increased wait times, for instance, at SSA. It's harder to deliver disaster assistance during emergencies due to cuts at places like FEMA and other agencies. A lot of that detail is in the partnership's report. But then it also talks about the impacts to federal employees themselves, how these things have changed morale, changed employee engagement, and how employees are doing day to day, really. So there's also been a lot of data from the Office of Personnel Management as well on some of these changes to the federal workforce. So we're seeing more transparency emerge, more stories emerge on how things have changed. Steyer from the partnership did give kudos to OPM for this new workforce data that they released, but he also had a more negative view of what that data actually depicted.
There's a lot of very rich material that, again, it tells a disturbing story about, who we've lost in our government, and what is actually happening to the workforce. But it doesn't tell you anything about what is truly most fundamental, which is their morale and what they think about what's happening right now.
As folks look ahead, Drew, are they optimistic that 2026 will bring more stability, or is there a downside to all of this?
What I think we're likely going to see throughout 2026 is, now that we have seen this big reduction in headcount, we've seen a lot of the initial and very fast-paced changes that the Trump administration made. We're going to start seeing a lot more of the deeper policy shifts come out over the next year. OPM Director Scott Cooper has talked extensively about changes to performance management for employees, changes to how employees are, or how job candidates are vetted, and making sure that they're hired based on their qualifications. And there's also one notable change that a lot of people have discussed that is still ahead, is the change called schedule policy / career, and that employment classification. Of course, as we know, that's a resurgence of the formerly known Schedule F. And that's something I think that we'll see coming forward that's going to have, some level of deeper impact or deeper change to the federal workforce. And Max Steyer, again, talked a little bit about what is ahead for federal employees here.
As challenging as 2025 was, I think we can expect even harder days ahead in 2026. The change of our federal government into one that is a loyalist workforce as opposed to a professional one is a process that we anticipate moving forward in 2026.
So the changes are going to keep coming, it sounds like.
That's right. We're going to be looking out for those regulations, further changes, as I said, to performance management, many other things that are still ahead in the coming months, and we'll be tracking all of it.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, it's good to have you on the case.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, a sweeping audit could reshape the 8A program, and federal contractors are bracing for what comes next. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The SBA, Pentagon, and Treasury are running simultaneous audits of the 8A program, each targeting different risks, but all aimed at restoring integrity to a system the administration says has been widely misused. The scale of the oversight is something the contracting community hasn't seen before. We'll explore what ties these reviews together and what contractors might expect with Emily Murphy, Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and former GSA Administrator. Emily, great to have you on the show.
Wonderful to be here. Happy New Year, Terry.
Thank you, and you too. Let's start our new year by digging into what's happening with the 8A program. It is probably under the tightest scrutiny in its 47-year history. Why does this administration care so much? What are they looking for?
I think that there are a few things that have converged right now and that have sort of put 8A in the spotlight. And part of it is actually what the Biden administration did with the 8A program. Which, if you remember, there's a statutory goal that says 5% of prime contract dollars are supposed to be awarded to small, socially and economically disadvantaged businesses. And 8A is the primary tool for making those awards. But President Biden, via executive order and some memos out of OMB, raised that goal to 15%, which brought a lot more money into the program, brought a lot more interest and scrutiny into the program, and led to the first of the lawsuits that we'd seen in, serious lawsuits we'd seen in about 20 years since post-Adirond about the 8A program. There was the Ultima case that was decided in 23 that said SBA could no longer presume certain categories were socially disadvantaged. So that sort of led to people starting to look at the 8A program and put things in flux. The other thing actually goes back maybe about 10 years further, which was Congress back in 2013, 2014, looked at limitation on subcontracting. And how did you make sure, not just in the 8A program, but in all the socioeconomic programs, that if you were giving work, setting aside work to a type of companies, the work was actually being done by those companies. And the old rules always said that 51% of the cost of the labor or 51% of the cost of the goods had to be done by the small business getting the award. 8A, woman-owned, HUBZone, service field veteran. But it was really hard to figure out if anyone was following that because small businesses don't usually engage in cost accounting. They certainly don't have the cost basis of their subcontractors to figure it out. So you never could really figure out whether anyone was complying. It created weird requirements for small businesses that we were hoping would grow into large businesses, where it said, just you're better off not teaming with anyone, just go it alone because you're not going to get in trouble. But then as soon as you become a large business or an other than small business, we want you to start contracting with other small businesses. So Congress came in and said, all right, rather than this 51% of cost basis, we're just going to look at the dollars that are awarded to the company. And we're going to start saying that 50% of the dollars that are awarded to a company under any contract may be subcontracted to companies that are not similarly situated. So if award went to a small business, they and other small businesses had to keep 50% of the dollars. And then they could use non-small businesses to do the remaining 50% of the work. They could work with other 8As to meet that 50% goal. And then the remaining 50%, they could use small businesses or women-owned small businesses or large businesses. But the plan was then to use the electronic subcontracting reporting system to track that and see whether or not that was being complied with. That hasn't happened. But the changes, and it took a while to get the regulations in place to implement those, have now given us some insight into how subcontracting is. It's made it much more easy to audit whether or not all small businesses, but in this case, 8As, are following those rules. And there was the O'Keefe Media Group where they caught one company on saying that they were subcontracting more than I think they were allowed to under the program. So you had these changes of the goals, which President Trump rolled back very beginning of January of 2025. But that didn't change the fact that a lot of new money had come into the program. And so the program is going to get a lot more scrutiny. This sort of led us to where we are now.
Well, the Pentagon has just announced that they're going to conduct their own line-by-line review. What does the administration hope to learn separately from the SBA investigation by the DOD? Taking a deep dive.
When I read saw the secretary's announcement on that, I thought it was interesting that he was making two different points. The first one was he wanted to make sure that all the contracts that were being awarded using the 8A program were following limitation on subcontracting. But he said that they were really going to focus on those that were above $20 million. Now, sole source contracts above $20 million don't go to just your average 8A company. There's a cap on sole source awards, and it depends on whether it's for goods or services, but it's less than half of that amount. The only companies getting $20 million sole source awards through the 8A program are Alaska Native corporations, Native Hawaiian organizations, tribally owned organizations that don't have the same affiliation restrictions that traditional 8As have, don't have the same management restrictions. So it's a special subclass of 8As. And they said that when they focused on those above $20 million, I thought it was interesting that they seemed to be looking at the larger 8A companies, the ones that have taken on more and more of this work.
Should we read anything particular into that focus?
I would think that was the distinction I saw between the general 8A reviews taking place at SBA, the reviews that were put out, or requests for review that were put out by Senator Ernst and Senate Small Business, and the work that was happening at the Pentagon. I also thought it was interesting the Pentagon said the other thing they wanted to do was make sure that these contracts were for things that align with their priorities. Now, that's always a good thing to do. You don't want to be spending money on things that don't align with your priorities. But I thought it was an interesting take from the Secretary's announcement that the contracts that he was focusing on were those that were tribal organization-owned 8A companies.
I'm speaking with Emily Murphy. She's Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and a former GSA administrator. Emily, let's turn to the other agency that's digging into the 8As, Treasury. They're looking at $9 billion of performance-based contracts. Where does that fit in this puzzle?
So the Treasury's looking at similar issues with task orders and others issued under the 8A program to whether or not they met the requirements, but also it's also getting into limitation on subcontracting, so you're seeing similar trends across all of the investigations. where the Secretary of War was talking about Beltway bandits, and Administrator Loeffler was talking instead about just looking at all 4,000 plus 8As. Treasury is looking specifically at those that they awarded, and that's a good place to start for them to make sure that they're actually meeting, once again, that you're not having what they're calling a pass-through, where now, one thing I do think is interesting is that this is all focused only on the 8A program, where the pass-through issue exists for all small business contracts. And so if I were a small business, I'd be making sure that any work that I'm doing, I wouldn't assume that this is going to stop with the 8A companies. I think that the 8As, because of that 15% goal in the prior administration, are getting a lot of focus. But I would be concerned if I were another small business to make sure that I was documenting that I was following limitation on subcontracting.
Let's dig into that a little bit, because all of this activity collectively has sort of raised the level of angst among the government contracting community. If you were a legitimate small business 8A provider, what should you expect as these reforms move forward?
So if you're following the rules, this shouldn't itself be a fundamental challenge, with two caveats on that. The first one being pause in the work and awards made to any 8A is going to change your pipeline and whether or not you're able to exist. So if your pipeline was based on sole source awards, of $4 million, $5 million, and there is a freeze on awards, that's going to put you in a more difficult spot in terms of, does the agency that was going to make the award have the capacity to go out and run a competition? Will they do it as an 8A set aside rather than as a sole source? Does it need to be removed from the 8A program first in order for that to happen? So there's some contracting challenges that go with that. The other challenge you've got is that if you look at the model deviation to Part 19 of the FAR that was issued last summer, it changed the basis of award for 8A as well. And it said that if 8A companies are on a multiple award contract, that instead of doing sole sources to those 8As, you should do a competitive award. And that if something has previously been in the 8A program and you want to instead award it to another socioeconomic group, say service-able veterans or women, you no longer need to go to SBA and ask their permission. You can go ahead and do it on your own. So those are the challenges I'd be focused on more if I were an 8A company that was convinced it was complying with the limitation on subcontracting rules.
And what do you think the administration is anticipating on the other side when they get these investigations complete and they see the results? Are we going to see tighter rules? Are we going to see a new version of the 8A, something completely different?
Well, Congress hasn't really gotten itself involved in the 8A program in decades now. SBA is somewhat constrained as to what it can or cannot change in the program on its own. And there are stakeholders on both sides of the 8A issue in Congress. You've got the ranking member on the House Small Business Committee has been a longtime champion of the 8A program. Senators from states that have a lot of tribal contracting tend to be supportive of the program because it brings work back to or revenue back to their states and to communities that they consider to be underserved. So how much flexibility the administration will have to make structural changes to the program, it remains to be seen. And how much collaboration that they're going to get. Are they going to take the results of that investigation and go to Congress and ask for changes? Or are they just going to change the practice of how they use the tools? Because again, there's a 5% goal for awarding contracts to socially and economically disadvantaged companies owned by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. But there is no mandate that you must use the 8A program to do that. Does the administration then decide by administrative practice that they're going to pull back and they're going to find other ways of meeting that goal?
Well, there's certainly going to be a lot to watch. Emily, thanks for your insight.
Thank you. It's a fun topic to be exploring and to be watching right now.
So much to watch. Emily Murphy is a senior fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and a former GSA administrator. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, with House spending bills done, focus turns to the Senate, where work is expected to wrap up this week ahead of the January 30th deadline. But first, the drone economy is about to take off fast, with drones as a service, the next big thing. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The economics of drone operations are about to change. One operator supervising 10 autonomous aircraft could redefine cost and margin for delivery and inspection. That future hinges on Part 108, a proposed FAA TSA rule that moves what are currently waiver-only experiments to a national standard. Here to break down the implications is James McDonald's Program Chair at Sonoran Desert Institute's School of Uncrewed Technology. Mr. McDonald's, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
We're going to talk about drones. The analyst market predicts a $355 billion drone market by 2026. That's amazing. What is driving that massive increase?
I think the drive behind that massive increase is the fact that we are now getting into a point where the FAA rules for what's called Part 108 is supposedly going to be released this year. And what that does is changes the scale and the way that drones are operated. In short, it allows drones to be operated beyond the pilot's visual line of sight, and it allows multiple drones to be operated by one operator or pilot. So what does that do? Well, with our current rules and regulations, you always have to have the pilot have eyes on the aircraft, unless you have a beyond visual line of sight waiver. Now, those are few and far between. Now, with standard rules to be able to fly beyond visual line of sight, instead of me having to fly all the way out to, say, Scott City, Kansas to do wind turbine inspections, we could have a drone parked out there at the wind turbine farm. I could wake up from my bed, walk over to my computer, connect to the drone over the internet, and fly it from my home instead. But not just the drone at that one farm. It could be drones across multiple wind farms across multiple states. Now you don't need to have a qualified operator be on location for every wind turbine inspection. You can have them be remote and operating multiple drones, making the operation more efficient. And not just one drone at a time. I could be flying maybe 4 or 5, even 10, maybe even 100 wind turbine inspections all at once, which if you think about it, decreases the overall cost of operation.
It seems like a recipe for attention deficit.
Well, it does kind of transform. In the past, I've been able to fly under a waiver that allowed one pilot to fly up to 10 aircraft at once. It does transition the mentality of a drone operator from just monitoring the aircraft and making sure everything's working properly and being active if need to being more of like an air traffic controller, but for drones instead of live aircraft, and for the drones under your control, not necessarily for all the drones in the airspace. So it definitely changes the mentality a bit, and it does take a lot of attention and a bit of multitasking for sure.
So, and that's different from the way we operate today because it's one pilot per drone and mostly within a visual line of sight.
Correct.
So this kind of opens up this concept of drones as a service. We've talked about software as a service, but now people could buy drones as a service. What would that mean in practice? So
it can mean different things. There's different profiles that some companies are already working with under what we call a beyond visual line of sight or multi-uncrewed aircraft systems waiver. And that means that you can now say if someone wants to have a drone on a construction site and have that drone do what we call project update photos. And it takes photos and images once a week or maybe multiple times a week at that location. Well, instead of having to have the operator come with it, you could have what's called a drone in a box system. So there's systems out there like a DJI dock or Percepto docking station or Skydio docks. So essentially it's this box that you put a power connector to it or provide power to it. You plug it into Ethernet or you have a internet wireless modem connected to it, and it provides the ability for it to stay powered on 24/7, and you can connect to it over the internet at any time as needed. So instead of having the operator come out with the drone and all the equipment each time they need to do a flight at that location to the service provider, they could set the drone in a box at a location, set it, forget it, and then have the operator connect to that aircraft, fly the aircraft, collect all the needed data, and then provide that data to whoever is purchasing the use of that aircraft as a service.
I'm speaking with James McDonald's. He's the Director of Uncrewed Technology Programs at the Sonoran Desert Institute. So there are some countries that are already kind of modeling this approach.
Yes.
What should we learn from them in their early adoption?
There's a lot of things to learn. We are in somewhat different environments for the countries that have adapted this faster than we have. And that is in cases like Zipline is a good company. They are a drone delivery company and they have nationwide operations in a multitude of countries outside of the United States. They have some operations here in the United States that are under waiver that they're conducting operations for, but it's not at the same scale. Now, companies like those and others that have learned how to operate those drones at scale and beyond visual line of sight and multiple at once can take all those lessons learned and safety lessons learned, because now it's not just one to one, it's one to many. And it's at a larger scale and it's in an airspace system that is now more complicated than the countries that they've operated in beforehand. Because countries that they may have operated in maybe have 2, 3, 4 international flights and with maybe some general aviation aircraft here and there. Now in the United States, we have thousands of flights every day in the airspace, as well as a lot of general aviation aircraft and hobbyist pilots out there. So that's the reason the FAA has had to collect all this data. And I think that is one challenge that'll still be left, is saying, okay, we're going to integrate this as best we know with the data we have. We may need to make further increases in safety changes to make sure that we're meeting that environmental change in comparison to where it's been done overseas.
It sounds like it increases security risks as well. Drones, unauthorized drones, could be in different kinds of airspaces, or for mega events, you may have drones all over the place. And how will the FAA know which ones are supposed to be there and which ones aren't?
So I love that question. Very good question. Right now, the FAA has what's called remote ID. And remote ID is required for all drones, even ones that are not flying commercially under Part 107. And what a remote ID does is put a small module on a drone that broadcasts the aircraft's name, type, altitude, and location. And if a drone does not have that on board and it's outside of what's called a free zone, it's an area where hobbyists can go that it's pre-approved to fly at, most likely your aviation models, aeronautics club areas that are made for radio controlled aircraft flying as a hobby. If it's not within that zone and it doesn't have a remote ID on it, it should not be there at all. It should not be allowed to fly at all. So that's an identifier. And there's apps that you can see the remote IDs that are being broadcasted by drones. So that's how currently both the public and the FAA can know who's supposed to be there and who's not.
It's one thing to be able to identify them. It's another to be able to eliminate them.
Yes, that is true. And that gets challenging, as we've seen in conflicts over in Ukraine, because both sides have been combating with, frequency jamming and other things as well. But now now everyone's referred to fiber optic lines and fiber optic cables that can be used to control these without necessarily jamming them. Well, when that becomes the case, the only other option is some form of kinetic, or even there's individuals and companies that have created drones with netting capture systems where another drone will go up, track this other aircraft, and deploy a net to capture it, and then it's hanging from this other drone and it brings that drone back. So there's been some creative solutions that are coming out for those kinds of aircraft that aren't supposed to be there in a situation where obviously you don't want them to be.
You talked early on about Part 108, the regulatory change that's coming from the FAA. Are there other regulations that will need to go along with that, or other processes to implement it that you'll be watching for?
Yes, and one of them was just released near the end of last year, and that is the process for drone delivery companies when they want to start up a new operations area. They have to do essentially a site survey, a large-scale site survey to say, okay, what's our airspace? What's our ground environment look like? What's the air traffic around the area? What are the obstacles that we have to contend with, both man-made and natural, that we have to evaluate for safety, and then submit as a application almost, if you will, to the FAA to say, okay, we want to start operations here. Here's the due diligence that we've done in order to start operations in that area. So even before ground is broken, a safety evaluation must be done for the flight operation that they plan to conduct at scale under Part 108.
You have said, though, that the real constraint here isn't regulation, it's talent. Tell us about what Sonoran Desert Institute is doing to train the folks who may be having to do these kinds of multi-drone controllers or other sorts of new technology management.
Well, certainly. So One of the things that we're doing, and it's not just about multi-UAS control or beyond visual line of sight. Recently, on December 23rd, the Federal Communications Commission actually banned foreign-made drones from being sold in the United States. So now it's not just about having competent pilots to expand to meet this new commercial need that's coming into place because of Part 108. It's also more individuals who can build, design, flight test, and validate aircraft that are now going to have to be more built in the United States and for manufacturers in the United States. So that's one of the key things we focus on, is not just operations of, visual line of sight, but operations and control for multitude of aircraft at once, how to handle that, how does that operation mindset look differently, and then even more importantly, how does one get into developing, validating, and producing uncrewed aircraft systems? Because that is definitely a need that we have right now in the industry, and we've had beforehand, because there's not a lot of suppliers out there or creators out there. And it's not just the drones themselves, it's the components that go into the drones. Drones are like a cool little puzzle that have a ton of electronics and a ton of software that all come together to make these things fly and usable for different industries. So we try to train on that, not just for the drone itself, but also for those individual components and softwares as well.
I've been speaking with James McDaniels. He's the Director of Uncrewed Technology Programs at Sonoran Desert Institute. Really appreciate you giving us a look into the future here. It sounds like a growth industry for sure.
It sure is, Terry. Thank you so much for your time and great questions.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, with House spending bills done, focus turns to the Senate, where work is expected to wrap up this week ahead of the January 30th deadline. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. With House spending bills finished, the spotlight turns to what Congress tackles next. From healthcare funding and ACA subsidies to renewed crypto legislation, and even early plans for a sweeping 2026 reconciliation package aimed at lowering costs. Here to help us sort through those priorities and what they mean for the months ahead is WTOP's Capitol Hill correspondent, Mitchell Miller. Mitchell, it's great to see you face to face. We're recording from your office on the Capitol today.
That's right. We are squeezed into my little booth here on the House side. We're 3 stories up, but we look down on the National Mall if you just walk down the hall. So it's great to have you here.
Thanks for the invitation. It's kind of quiet up on the Hill today, but there's a lot to talk about that happened last week. Let's start with the House completing all their spending bills. I guess the biggest surprise was that they got the DHS bill through. What did it take to get agreement on that?
You know, it was really interesting, I think, because they were so close to the finish line that they decided, even though there are a lot of reservations on the Democratic side, there were these 7 Democrats that said, we are going to vote for this regardless. And that was really the key. And there was also a lot of discussion, as you know, about Republicans, about whether they would have enough people, because we've had absences. The margin is always super tight. But I think they were confident enough that that was actually the first bill of a series of bills that they took up. So it seems like House Speaker Mike Johnson finally knew that he was going to have the votes on that, which is not always the case. And then they were able to move on to the omnibus with the package of defense and transportation, education, et cetera. So that final omnibus, so that they could get out of town, basically, before the weather hit.
And do you think those agreements that they finally got through on the House side will carry over into the Senate?
I think for the most part they will. There are a few items in the overall omnibus that could give pause to some members of the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats. On the Democratic side, we're still going to have the issue with DHS and whether or not they're going to go ahead with ICE. A lot of Democrats have said they will just not support it no matter what. The other interesting issue, which was kind of a surprise last week, was the House effectively jammed the Senate by approving this provision that says basically they cannot allow for the suing of the government in connection with these calls that were monitored during the January 6th investigation. Senators were really upset about it, particularly, obviously, Republican senators. And so they had included that provision earlier. The Republicans in the House actually went along with Democrats and reversed it. So they would have to take that out of the omnibus if they are going to pass it. So I think it's going to stay in there, and there will be some grumbling among Republican senators, but I think that's going to stay in the legislation.
Well, the president said last week he's anticipating a shutdown again. Does that seem practical?
That was also kind of a surprise to a lot of people because there has been a little bit of a chest beating here in the House, particularly about the fact that they actually got all these 12 appropriations bills done. Now, granted, they were supposed to be done by October 1st, so let's not praise ourselves too much. But nonetheless, the fact that that happened, there was a lot of confidence moving forward. And so when the president said that he thought that there might be a shutdown, I think a lot of people read that as basically another effort to ding the Democrats, to say, if anything bad happens, it's going to be the Democrats' fault. So he's kind of setting the stage just in case that happens. But I don't think, barring some really surprising developments, that we are looking at a partial government shutdown.
Well, that's good to hear. Just sort of one other question while we're on this topic. The Senate was out on recess last week. This giant storm has really snarled travel. Do they have enough days left to get through the remaining bills, get them approved, get them to the president to get signed in time?
Well, as much as the senators have a lot of pull, they can't really do anything about the weather, right? So they are dealing with all of these issues that every American across the country is dealing with. I think what will happen, though, is the Senate, as you know, can essentially create its own rules. So if they go by the book and they go through everything like they would normally do, they would not have the time to do this. But I think they are going to get these agreements during this week where they can speed things up and eventually get this done. Even if it weren't to be done by January 30th, I think it's going to be done within a day or two.
That's good to hear. I'm speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, beyond appropriations, there were other things that happened last week. Let's talk about health insurance executives who testified on the Hill. What does that mean for future agreements around healthcare policy and the ACA subsidies?
Well, that was a really interesting hearing last week because you had Republicans and Democrats kind of in reverse roles. In this case, Republicans were going after health executives and saying, why are you increasing these rates? Why is everything going so expensively? And then on the Democratic side, they were actually defending a lot of the CEOs and these people that are high up in the health industry, saying that they are doing the best that they can. They want to move this forward. And I think part of that is because Democrats are still trying to keep things somewhat status quo and get this extension of these ACA subsidies. However, I really don't think that these ACA subsidies, at least the 3-year plan that the Democrats want, is going to move forward. It seems like after we had a lot of really positive developments over the last few weeks, it got kind of bogged down again. So we're, again, debating issues about health savings accounts, whether or not the middlemen can be taken out with pharmaceuticals, that type of thing. So I think that's going to take longer than people anticipated.
There was another, maybe some progress last week on crypto. That got sidelined for a while and came back. Tell us about what's going on there.
Yeah, there's a couple of things related to crypto in the Agriculture Department, which actually has some of the regulatory oversight related to it. They did advance things and they are moving forward and feel pretty good about it. However, on the flip side, in the Banking Committee, which has done a lot of work related to regulatory issues, especially how much sway should the SEC, for example, have in regulating crypto, things have bogged down a little bit over there. So it looks like that this week, the Agriculture Committee is actually going to advance some of the legislation that they've been working on. However, in the Senate Banking Committee, which is more of a broader regulatory look at things, that one's going to take longer, and we're hearing that may not really get taken up until February or March.
Are the folks behind these bills integrating the provisions to make sure that they make sense when they finally pass together?
I think they are. Right now, I think we're kind of in that, sausage making stage where they have to kind of reconcile everything once they get out. But as you know, there's been a big push to get crypto legislation. And we keep hearing every few months that they're right on the precipice and then something comes up. There was a big crypto company actually recently that had some reservations about it. So I think a lot of the lobbyists in connection with crypto are trying to, work things into the legislation some more over the next few weeks.
Well, there's new talk starting really just last week about another giant reconciliation bill. You can only have one a year, so they're starting to talk about one for 2026. What might we see if that effort moves forward?
Well, as you know, Republicans are really concerned about affordability issues. Despite what the president says sometimes about it being a hoax, he's been out there trying to speak about it. And Republicans on Capitol Hill are really nervous about that right now. So they want to include things that will lower the costs of living for people. Address housing is one that you hear a lot about. They really want to do something with that. But there is a little bit of a division within the GOP. Some people just think that there's just not enough energy to get things passed again after the big, beautiful bill from this past year. On the other hand, a lot of Republicans are worried that what will happen to them is what happened earlier with the Democrats when the Democrats passed their large piece of legislation. And that is this whole idea that, oh, if we just get out there and we sell the bill and tell people what's in it and let them know that we extended these tax cuts, all of these things, that they'll magically start thinking, oh, well, I'm going to vote Republican again, or I'm going to vote against Democrats. And I think there is some skepticism about whether that will work politically. And that's why you hear about this big push for another reconciliation bill. And in fact, OMB head Russ Vought was actually speaking with Republicans recently about that, saying they really need to try to do something. So it's really going to be interesting to see what happens over the next few months, of whether they can get some momentum for that.
So 2 questions to follow on. One, are there enough specific proposals that would actually address affordability to make a bill? And second, timing, that would come out just before the midterm. So how does it all fit together?
Right. I think there is a bit of skepticism about whether or not there is enough specifically to get into a big bill. You know, if you're going to try to sell another huge piece of legislation, but you only have a handful of things that are in it, maybe there are some ones specific to housing that a lot of people could get behind. But beyond some of these other issues, it looks like it's a little bit vague. And then to your point about the timing, Congress in this coming year is going to be out a lot because it's a midterm election year. People are going to be on the road. We've already had one of the members of the House who has not voted more than 24 times because he's campaigning in Texas. So that type of dynamic is going to make it very, very hard, I think, even with the Republicans still in power, to try to get some kind of reconciliation legislation passed.
I've been speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, thanks again for inviting me up to your cubicle today.
All right. And thank you for coming up to the Capitol. Appreciate it.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. For government oversight and accountability officials, 2025 was a year of deep change and uncertainty. President Donald Trump fired inspectors general, removed the heads of independent agencies, and sought to reduce the level of internal oversight within government. But members of the oversight community say their job is more important than ever as they prepare for challenges both near and long term. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday reports.
It was a tough year for fans of independent oversight in government. President Trump has fired 19 inspectors general so far, and he's targeted agencies once thought to be independent, ranging from the Office of Special Counsel to the Government Accountability Office. But current and former officials say the oversight community is grappling with issues that aren't exclusive to the Trump administration. At a January 15th workshop hosted by Virginia Tech's School of Public and International Affairs, members of the oversight community discussed the challenges, both near and long term. To be sure, Trump's targeting of inspectors general was top of mind for many attendees. Max Dyer is president and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service.
When an administration walks in and fires 17 IGs for no good reason, that presents the evidence that in itself speaks for itself. Our oversight capacity for our government is being harmed. And there are a lot of other actions that have taken place since then that unfortunately reinforce the challenge that is being presented to oversight and beyond.
A federal court found those firings were illegal because Trump did not provide the required 30-day notification to Congress about the removals. But the court found there was no way to remedy that violation, and lawmakers have done little to reinforce the law they passed in 2022 requiring the president to provide notification. James Christian Blockwood, president and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration, compared the situation to flagging down a police officer when a driver is clearly speeding.
But what if the police officer is doing nothing? What if all the mechanisms you put in place, the speeding cameras, and all the different mechanisms, everyone's seeing what's happening, but there's no consequence. We need to make sure that there's a consequence. That's where we need to be thinking about where does that ultimate accountability lie, and how do we help those that have the responsibility to make sure that the things happen that need to happen are doing that job.
And last September, Office of Management and Budget Director Russell Vought also moved to defund the Council on Inspectors General for Integrity and Efficiency. Congress created SIGI, as it's known, in 2008. Allison Lerner is the former IG of the National Science Foundation.
SIGI has so many statutory responsibilities, but it also does things even beyond that to help this community stay connected and to work as efficiently and effectively as possible. And if we don't have a strong SIGI, it's really undermining the spine of what's enabled us to come together over the last 15 years.
OMB has since released some funding for SIGI, but the White House says it's conducting a programmatic review of the council's activities. The Trump administration hasn't just targeted oversight within the executive branch. GAO is a legislative branch agency, but Vought has sought to minimize its role and even said GAO shouldn't exist in the first place. The Trump administration has been at loggerheads with GAO over its role enforcing the Impoundment Control Act, which prohibits agencies from withholding funds appropriated by Congress. GAO has found several violations of that act over the past year, and its reports note that in some cases, agencies aren't providing GAO with requested information. But GAO's acting chief operating officer, Nicole Clowers, says access issues aren't necessarily a new problem for auditors.
We've experienced them for decades under both parties, various administrations. And so it's not party specific or administration specific. So we do have some muscle memory and techniques that we use, but we're certainly expanding on them now.
The Trump administration has also massively reshaped the role of the federal government in just 1 year in office. For Clowers, all those changes only reinforce the need for agencies like GAO.
Where I stand, oversight is as important as ever. And I would argue more important than ever. For one, the federal government's role is undergoing a significant transformation. Whether you agree with the policy changes that are being made or you disagree with the policy changes, I think we all can agree that changes will have a profound impact on how federal programs operate, at least for the near future, maybe longer term as well.
One of the big challenges for oversight organizations is communicating with stakeholders and the general public about their work. That's where leaders like Steyer see a big opportunity.
How do we better engage and educate those? And it's going to depend a lot on the audience we're talking about. But I think we have to look in the mirror and say, are we talking in a way that people will actually care about? And is this something that is just sounding like inside baseball, which is, more typically what we actually do?
Blockwood says oversight leaders should embrace the discomfort of doing things differently while staying true to the fundamental principles of audits and investigations.
Can you be more real time in what you're doing? How do you offer more transparency and communication to what those findings are? The timeline. We are well beyond where you can take months to do a study. You can still do that and it will produce good information at the end, but you have to have other packages and products that have some early findings as to what to do with it. And we need to be really, really focused on outcomes so that you're not just looking at maybe something happens and yes, it was good, but you didn't follow the exact prescription of the way it should have been done. That can't be like the future of how we look at accountability, auditing, and investigations.
At GAO, big changes are already underway. Longtime Comptroller General Gene Dodaro retired at the end of 2025. It's an uncertain time to be losing one of the oversight community's most steadfast figures. But Clowers says GAO is leaning into the future. It's looking at the use of technologies like artificial intelligence to help speed up audits. And Clowers says GAO is constantly evolving how to best communicate the value of its work through blogs, podcasts, and other mediums. Clowers says those priorities and more are top of mind as GAO embraces what she calls a pivotal moment for the auditing and oversight community.
When you think about the challenges, when you think about the time that we're at, we can make ourselves small, right? And hope no one notices us and sort of weather things like that. Or we can continue to carry out our mission and do the right things, which has always been GAO's goal. And I can't speak for everyone, but I can assure you that at GAO, we're focused on mission and we're singularly focused on achieving that mission and will continue to be so.
Justin Doubleday, Federal News Network.
You can find Justin's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editors are Daisy Thornton and Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.